What if China attacks Taiwan? One of the biggest geopolitical questions in the entire world right now is the future of China and how they will continue to impact the world stage, particularly in regards to their relationship with Taiwan. With government officials in Taiwan recently being quoted as saying that a full-scale invasion from China could be easily possible as early as 2025, and with tensions currently at their highest point in 40 years, this is a question that's on everybody's minds, and could just be one of the biggest events of this entire decade if an attack ever came to pass. China and Taiwan have a very complicated history, one that's the basis for their fractured and stressed relationship in the modern era. After being returned as a province to China after Japan's surrender at the end of the Second World War, Taiwan was then fled to by the Republic of China leadership following the Chinese Civil War and the ascension of the Chinese Communist Party as the government in mainland China. Ever since, Taiwan has settled into a democratic government under the name of the Republic of China, seeing itself as a mostly independent state, whereas the Chinese Communist Party maintains a position known as the One China principle, the idea that Taiwan's semi-independence is just temporary, that all of China is one inalienable whole, and that someday Taiwan will rejoin the Chinese collective. This stance has been awkward over the years for Taiwan, as politically some citizens favor closer diplomatic ties with China, while others yearn for Taiwan to be its own independent nation with its own unique culture. Despite this, to appease China, most nations do not have any official diplomatic ties with Taiwan, instead only communicating with mainland China to maintain the One China position. Despite this, countries like the United States do have some unofficial communication and even a policy to provide Taiwan with weaponry to defend itself against any foreign invaders, as a holdover from the Cold War when the United States was especially interested in preventing the spread of communism and USSR allies across the globe. In recent years, China has particularly stepped up their aggression when it comes to Taiwan's borders and has made multiple statements about China's reunification potentially having to happen through force. In 2018, China began demanding that any international partners trading with Taiwan had to refer to it as being part of China. Since then, China's military drills off the coast of Taiwan and excursions into Taiwanese airspace have been becoming more and more common, with the first half of 2021 having nearly as many reports of Chinese aircraft in the area as the entirety of 2020. Furthermore, while reports of aircraft would typically only mean surveillance-style planes, the reports within the last year or so have all seen the majority of their planes now be fighter jets, with the occasional bomber being tested as well. Now, this is likely posturing and training exercises being conducted on China's part, rather than actual attempts at reaching the island of Taiwan, but it does show that China is getting bolder and bolder with just how much pressure it feels it can put up against Taiwan's borders, and in particular, just how much Chinese forces are capable of navigating beyond the median line between Taiwan and China proper. If China did decide to launch a full invasion of Taiwan, what would that look like? Well, initially things would appear to be very dire for the Taiwanese side of the conflict. China currently has over 2,185,000 active military members, the largest in the world ahead of both India and the United States, and a number that's literally 10 times the size of Taiwan's active military. China is also one of the 9 countries worldwide to possess nuclear weapons, with over 250 warheads and bombs within their arsenal. Luckily, the chance of China utilizing any form of nuclear weaponry during an invasion of Taiwan is very low, as its proximity to the mainland would likely mean unprecedented damage to their own country, along with all of the dangers of nuclear escalation from the rest of the world. Instead, China would likely rely on its massive amount of air, land, and naval forces to attempt to seize Taiwan and its capital city of Taipei directly. However, this would be a lot easier said than done. Taiwan's military might be only 10% of the size of China's, but they've been training since the very formation of Taiwan as an independent state for this exact scenario, some sort of attack from the Chinese mainland. Defending against an invasion gives you some inherent advantages compared to trying to invade and attack a new location. The defending army will have the home field advantage, with much more knowledge about the area and the best locations to stage a defensive position, or where to mislead the enemy into attacking. Taiwan's weaponry capabilities are also beyond what one would expect from an island with the population of Australia. Although the United States might not recognize Taiwan as a fully independent country, it's still written into US law that weapons must be exchanged with Taiwan so that they can defend themselves from outside threats. Thus, any Chinese attack on Taiwan would find themselves going up against artillery units, tanks, and machine guns all made in America, even if they were still only being used by the Taiwanese military. That being said, if China did fully cross the line and commit to an invasion of Taiwan, the United States and indeed the rest of the world might not be able to sit back. Both of the most recent presidents of the United States, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, have adopted a stronger stance against China compared to their predecessors due to China's increasing growth on the world stage, and an outright attack by China on a democracy right at their doorstep would be big news for the rest of the world. The US government in 2021 has taken the stance of telling China to back down from its posturing to Taiwan, with a White House spokesperson saying, "We urge Beijing to cease its military, diplomatic, and economic pressure and coercion against Taiwan. We have an abiding interest in peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. That is why we'll continue to assist Taiwan in maintaining a sufficient self-defense capability." If China refuses to back down and fully commits to attacking Taiwan, the US would have no choice but to live up to this threatening reminder and supply even more defenses to Taiwan, which in the case of a full invasion could mean sending US troops themselves. The enormity of both the United States and China and their status as two of the biggest global superpowers means that a direct military versus military confrontation between the two of them would be disastrous. The Cold War was cold for a reason, after all. Instead, this situation with Taiwan would give both countries a proxy location and reasoning for finally directly competing with one another. To make things even more complicated, Britain and Australia both recently formed a new military alliance with the United States specifically to try and counter Chinese influence throughout the global stage. If the US was obligated to help defend Taiwan while it was being invaded, the situation could risk snowballing into a geopolitical nightmare, with multiple countries forced to take sides among the many involved superpowers. There would be so many variables at play that trying to determine the most likely would be entirely foolish. This could mean a brief rise in tensions in countries before everyone stands down, it could mean the escalation of current tensions into a second Cold War, or it could mean the start of the World War III that we've all been trying to avoid for so many decades. No matter what the future holds, all of us here at Life's Biggest Questions obviously want peace to win in the end. So we'll all be crossing our fingers and hoping that calmer and cooler heads will prevail, and China and Taiwan will be able to find a solution that leaves both groups satisfied and content without the threat of conflict hanging over both their heads. Can America defend against an invasion from China? Out of all the potential doomsday scenarios, one of the most interesting to think about is the possibility of one of the world's greatest superpowers attacking another of the world's greatest superpowers. This would be a war on a scale seldom seen in human history, and if China did commit to an invasion of the continental US, it would be an undertaking of absolutely colossal scale, and the question becomes whether the United States has what it takes to be able to push back. Now, in modern times, the United States of America are often seen by experts as being nearly impossible to directly invade. In the last 100 years, Pearl Harbor is the only example of a major military operation performed by an enemy nation on American soil, with the possible exception of several captured German spies during World War II. A large part of this is due to America's relative isolation compared to many countries in Europe and Asia, with both Canada and Mexico Mexico being long-term allies of the United States, there's no neighboring country that has a risk of invading across the borders of their land. And if any country that wasn't Canada or Mexico tried to invade across either the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean at the east or west coast respectively, they would have an incredibly difficult time making landfall. The US coastline is incredibly well equipped to know if anything is coming, and any invasion force coming by air or sea would be almost immediately detected and able to be defended against, if not outright destroyed before ever reaching landfall. And even if China was able to deploy troops that couldn't be detected by American radar and somehow avoided detection, grabbing some sort of foothold on American soil would be nearly impossible. With major cities like Boston and New York in the east and Seattle and Los Angeles in the west, there are plenty of major cities that may seem like appealing targets, but would be heavily protected by the US military and fully capable of becoming a base of operations to push any landing Chinese forces back out into the sea. Without the ability to create any form of controlled zone for the Chinese, any invasion would be depending entirely on supply lines across the ocean and have no ability to bunker down with defenses. It would almost be a better idea for China to attempt invading either Mexico or Canada and then attempt a more land-based invasion, but even then, the United States would never allow China to establish a military foothold that close to their mainland. Chinese forces at sea would be intercepted as much as possible, and even in the unlikely scenario that China could gain a foothold in Canada or Mexico, taking advantage of that foothold and pushing onto American soil would be incredibly difficult. Much of the borderland between Canada and the US or Mexico and the US is relegated to rural communities and wilderness, ideal terrain for guerrilla attacks or bombing defenses if a land invasion began to occur from either the north or south. Now, modern United States military doctrine revolves around the concepts of power projection and full spectrum operations. Power projection is all about the idea of being able to apply military pressure at any point on the globe, no matter how far that point is from America's natural borders, with as little travel and setup time as possible. The idea is that America's military capabilities should be viable anywhere on the planet, a relatively new idea when you consider the thousands of years of previous military human experience that were forced to think much more locally due to the time period they lived in. While America's focus on mobility and potential military maneuvers anywhere on the planet might be useful for some form of counterattack against China, or potentially even cutting off Chinese supply lines if the invasion was a more sustained effort, America's focus would have to be on its own country's immediate defenses rather than their usual tactic of taking advantage of their global presence. The full spectrum operations philosophy, meanwhile, means that America's military might is never focused just on attacking or defending, but on a combination of both potentials and combining civil support operations alongside any destructive intentions. This would be especially important if America were defending against invasion on its own shores, as maintaining infrastructure and keeping civilians safe would be enormously important to keep overall American morale up and to keep the situation from turning any bleaker. Another important consideration around America's military doctrine would be whether the United States was already engaging in war with another country at the time that China decided to invade. You see, under the leadership of LBJ during the 1960s, the United States had a two-war policy, at the height of the Cold War even reaching a two-and-a-half-war policy. This meant that the United States Armed Forces should be fully ready and capable of fighting wars on 2.5 different fronts at the same time. During the 60s, this was understood to mean that in a worst-case scenario, the United States should be able to hold off a war in Europe against the Soviet Union, while simultaneously fighting in Asia against either China or North Korea, and be able to fight a small war in the Third World if needed, which was considered the half portion of the 2.5 war policy. However, in recent times, this policy has been altered as the realities of modern war become more complicated and technology reliant, with the current system being implemented in the 90s by President Bill Clinton under a new policy called win, hold, win, meaning that the United States must at all times be capable of winning one war front while holding back the forces of another long enough to be able to decisively win against both enemy parties. While the US is not currently committed to a large war against any enemies at the moment, several countries could take the initiative during a Chinese invasion to cause trouble at other locations around the globe, usually protected by US involvement, further complicating things for the invaded country. The one area where China might have an advantage over the US initially during an invasion would be through sheer numbers. With 2.2 million active personnel compared to the US's 1.4 million, China would definitely have more soldiers deployed to a battlefield, especially if they were the invading force. With current estimates putting their reserve military personnel at around 8 million, almost surely some of these forces would also be upgraded to active if a military campaign as large as invading the United States was required. This means that on a man versus man level, the US would be severely outgunned. Fortunately for America, the US military would still have the advantage for literal guns. With a military budget nearly 3 times the size of China's for a much smaller force, American tech would be a huge advantage for the US side when combined with all of the previously stated advantages for their country's location. It doesn't matter how many people you have to shoot guns when the Americans can just bomb those people before they even have a chance to reach the shore and pick up arms. At the end of the day, a direct invasion from China anytime in the near future is an incredibly low possibility, but it's a question that's still interesting to discuss and ponder about. The world is so interconnected that such a drastic action would cause a tidal wave of cause and effect across the globe, completely changing how many countries relate to one another and potentially reshaping the entire geopolitical makeup of the planet. And while America's military might should prevent it from being flat out invaded for many, many years to come, it's still a good idea for the strongest military not to get too complacent. You never know what the future might be holding for all of us.
What if North Korea attacked China tomorrow? It certainly wouldn't be the smartest idea for North Korea, and to put it simply, it would likely be an all-out bloodbath. The relationship between China and North Korea has fluctuated quite a bit in the past, and to fully understand what a North Korean attack on China would mean, we need to take a look at what has happened between these two countries in the past. The relationship between these two countries really stems back to the 1950s and the Korean War. During this time, China showed its support by flooding the Korean peninsula in order to aid their northern allies. It was after this war that China began receiving North Korean refugees and students, and China was also helping quite a bit with economic aid while the war was ongoing. Once the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed, which was designed to, quote, ensure a complete cessation of hostilities and of all acts of armed force in Korea until a final peaceful settlement is achieved. Both China along with members of the Eastern Bloc began providing extensive economic assistance to Pyongyang in order to help reconstruct the city and the country, as well as the economic development of North Korea. So this was all going on from about 1950 to 1953 or 54, and then in 1956 came the August Faction Incident. This is when some pro-China figures within the Korean government tried to remove Kim Il-sung from power with the support of China and the Soviet Union. This of course failed, so the only thing it really did was form the historical basis for North Korea to fear Chinese interference. Despite this, however, the two countries stayed on relatively friendly terms. In the 1960s, there was more deterioration in the relationship between the two countries when the Korean Workers' Party criticized the Cultural Revolution, which was a socio-political movement in China which was launched by Mao Zedong. The goal of the movement was to preserve Chinese communism by purging all remnants of capitalist and traditional elements from Chinese society. The Korean Workers' Party also described Mao Zedong as an old fool who had gone out of his mind. Because of this, the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, recalled its ambassador from Pyongyang in October of 1966. This was also when the Red Guards, which was a mass student-led paramilitary social movement which was guided by Mao, criticized North Korea as being revisionist. Despite all of these ongoings in the 1960s, in 1961 the two countries signed the Sino-North Korean Mutual Aid and Cooperation Friendship Treaty. This treaty meant that China was pledging to immediately give military as well as other assistance to its northern ally to help against any kind of outside attack. This now brings us to more recent times, in 2009. This marked the year when the Chinese paramount leader Hu Jintao and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-il declared 2009 as the year of the China and Democratic Republic of North Korea friendship, which was said to mark 60 years of diplomatic relations between the two countries. So it seemed as though things were on the up and up back in 2009. That was until August of 2012 rolled around. During this time, Kim Jong-un was now in power and was the leader of North Korea, and his uncle had a meeting with Hu. Rumor has it that during this meeting the uncle said to Hu that he wanted to replace Kim Jong-un with his brother. This meeting was allegedly recorded by the then Secretary of the Central Political and Legal Affairs Commission, who then informed Kim Jong-un of what was said. In December of 2013, the uncle who came up with this plan was executed for treason, and in 2014, the secretary I just mentioned was publicly put under investigation for corruption and other crimes and was arrested in December. This is super important because it was said that this was when the distrust Kim Jong-un has for China was really sparked because they had failed to inform him of this plan to overthrow him, and China began to dislike him because he executed someone that they trusted. By mid-2013, the relationship between the two countries hit a low point and things weren't getting any better anytime soon. Back in 2006, there was a strain in the relationship between the two countries when Pyongyang tested a nuclear weapon and Beijing backed UN Security Council Resolution 1718, which imposed sanctions on the city. This kind of marked a shift in the tone that was coming from China. It shifted from more diplomatic support to punishment. This is important because in 2017, after the North Korean missile launch test, China called on North Korea to cease actions that increased tensions on the Korean peninsula. A lot of the more recent issues between the two countries stem back to nuclear weapons. Since 2003, China has participated in six-party talks about how to resolve the issues of the North Korean nuclear weapons program. China is North Korea's biggest trading partner and arguably has the most leverage on the country. That is why in 2017, when China halted import of coal from North Korea, things began to take a more negative twist. In 2017, the Korean Central News Agency had some serious words for China when they said, quote, "A string of absurd and reckless remarks are now heard from China every day only to render the present bad situation tenser. China had better ponder over the grave consequences to be entailed by its reckless act of chopping down the pillar of the DPRK-China relations." They also said that the Chinese support for sanction in North Korea were, quote, "an undisguised threat to an honest, mid-minded neighboring country which has a long history and tradition of friendship," and that, quote, "the DPRK will never beg for the maintenance of friendship with China." Since 2018, things have slowly been on the rise between the two countries, and the relationship is undoubtedly getting better, but now that we understand the complicated history between the two countries, what would happen if North Korea attacked China tomorrow? Well, it probably would be terrible for North Korea. Firstly, let's just think about the size difference of the two places. North Korea is minuscule compared to China. That just wouldn't even be fair. Have you ever heard of the saying, "Don't bite the hand that feeds you"? Well, this really applies to North Korea and how terrible of an idea it would be for them to attack China. I'm not saying that China feeds North Korea per se, but China does a lot to protect them. China has spoken out on multiple occasions, particularly when things between North Korea and the United States were getting a bit dicey, to say that they will support and defend North Korea. Remember the friendship treaty from before? It all goes hand in hand. I had also previously mentioned how China is North Korea's biggest trading partner. If North Korea were to attack China, they're not only losing their greatest defense and ally, but they are also putting themselves in an economically tricky situation, as a large portion of their imports and exports would be immediately halted. North Korea ranks quite low as being a source of imports for China, but reversely, North Korea depends on China for trade as well as aid, not to mention how expensive it is to cause an attack on another country. If North Korea were to attack China tomorrow, the chances are that it would likely be some sort of nuclear attack. I mean, why would you spend all that time with your nuclear weapons to the detriment of the relationship with your closest ally, only to never use them? Also, this is truly the only way that North Korea can make a large enough impact on China, as, like I mentioned before, the size difference is just too huge. At the end of the day, an attack by North Korea on China would cause a lot of chaos, it would be one of the worst military ideas for North Korea, and it just wouldn't get anyone anywhere. It might even completely backfire on North Korea and cause China to gain even more power by taking over the country in the end. I think the good news here is that it doesn't seem like this one is gonna happen anytime soon. I mean, at least we hope.
What if Russia attacks China? When the future of global politics are discussed, one of the most frequently covered topics is how America and other Western countries will deal with the recurring aggression from Russia and China in different ways across the world in the 21st century. But a question that doesn't often get posed is what would happen if Russia decided to turn its back on years of stability between the two nations and launched an attack on China? The results might not be what you'd expect. First of all, we need to take a look at why China and Russia haven't waged war since the border disputes of pre-World War I, because before those days, everyone was kind of squabbling with everyone. China and Russia are both countries known for expansion and antagonizing neighboring states, so it's curious that they so rarely showed this intent towards each other, as the two countries are neighbors in Eastern Europe. On the Chinese side of things, this may come down to the specific military philosophy that's been passed down for thousands of years regarding land that shouldn't be conquered. The idea is that if a nation has both A, its own unique culture and national identity, and B, a natural barrier between itself and China, the country is already considered a lost cause in regards to potentially expanding Chinese influence and territory. The idea is that if a country might have strong reasons for maintaining independence and their own identity, a revolution against the Chinese is inevitable, and any natural barriers such as mountains, an ocean, or impassable terrain means that China would have an increasingly hard time holding on to control in such a region if an uprising ever did occur. The Chinese military would see America's invasions of both Vietnam and Iraq to be examples of why invading such countries are bad investments. Even if victory or gains might be achieved at first, maintaining those gains will eventually get more and more difficult until you're dealing with a lost cause. So, for this reason, China has never attempted to expand into Russia during the 21st century. Not even counting the usual never invade Russia in winter advice, the dual threat of the Mongolian desert and the Altai Mountains in between the two countries means that maintaining control of Russia would be an incredibly difficult task. As for Russia's perspective, attacking one of their biggest communist allies during any of the Cold War would have been beyond foolish, and even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, have stayed on good terms with China. Attacking would be disrespecting a crucial ally against America and the rest of the West, and likely wouldn't end well for Russia anyways. You see, while Russia is often talked about as if it's the most notable enemy on the world stage, with its attempted hacks into the democratic process in America being a key example, its military might compared to China's is actually a little bit questionable. In terms of active military units, Russia currently only has 1,014,000 on-duty personnel at the moment, compared to China's 2.2 million, over doubling that. This gap in force becomes even wider when you consider that at least half of Russia's conscripted ground forces are not currently located in Russia, but are stationed throughout the Northern, Baltic, and Black Sea fleets and other areas of interest to Russia across Europe and the globe. Meanwhile, China's population itself is literally 10 times that of Russia, meaning if a war ever began to drag out, they would have far, far more forces that could be additionally conscripted compared to Russia's reserves. Additionally, while Russia is often lauded for the quality of its weaponry and the tech it uses to wage war, Russia is a declining superpower when compared to China, and the gap in the quality of their guns and weaponry is getting smaller and smaller by the day, to the degree that the quality of the tech would likely have very little input on the actual outcome of an extended war between these two countries. However, there is one area where the difference in tech between Russia and China might be noteworthy, and that's in regards to nuclear weaponry. China is known to have approximately 350 nuclear weapons, a scarily large stockpile until you consider that the Russians allegedly have 6,257, nearly 18 times as many. While both countries have some form of ballistic missile defenses, the sheer amount of nuclear weaponry between the two countries is intimidating to say the least, especially if you're China. In normal circumstances, nuclear weapons would likely never be used in such a close-quarters war. Russia and China are literally on each other's doorsteps, and nuking your next-door neighbor is going to have disastrous consequences on the health of your own people, not even taking into consideration the disastrous potential for mutually assured destruction and nuclear escalation spinning wildly out of control. If one country starts using nuclear weapons, practically every country would now consider using them as a method to contain their world-destroying potential. This is the reason that the Cold War had to remain cold, and why nuclear weapons generally aren't used in modern conflicts. However, if we are already facing a scenario where Russia is invading China, all bets are off. As a superpower that declines in stature on the world stage a little bit year by year, and with China's economic growth continuing to rise, Russia may find itself in a situation where desperate maneuvers like a nuclear attack might seem less crazy. If Russia had already committed as many troops as it could, and felt like they couldn't back down from combat with China that they themselves initiated, Russia could see their massive nuclear armory as a way to surprise and to overwhelm the huge amount of Chinese armed forces they would be dealing with on the border. This leaves China in the unenviable situation that America found themselves in during the first Cold War, not escalating Russia's aggression to the levels where it would find nuclear weapons a healthy option for victory. Furthermore, even if China is capable of pushing back the initial Russia invasion and no nuclear weapons are used, any counterattacks by China into Russian land would be difficult to pull off. Again, there's a reason that both Hitler and Napoleon found out the hard way that you shouldn't invade Russia, and that's because Russia's terrain and weather seem tailor-designed by the gods to prevent easy access by enemies. China's chances of some sort of attack or invasion in retaliation would be almost impossible, even with millions of ground forces. The terrain of Russia and the inherent advantages in holding a defensive position would mean that even with all of our 21st century advancements, war with Russia would not be easy. All the while, if both Russia and China were focused on themselves and attacking one another, this would give the United States of America an opportunity to assess the situation and decide whether intervention is necessary, or if letting two of America's current enemies fight each other winds up being better for America in the end anyways. All in all, if Russia decided to attack and invade China, it would be one of the most surprising events in modern human history, and completely change the face of global politics. New allegiances would have to be drawn, and countries around the world would suddenly be faced with the choice of whether to pick a side in this superpower conflict or remain on the sidelines and see what happens. As the war dragged on, countries could seek to take advantage of the opportunity and attempt to also attack either China or Russia, either literally with their military or simply by instating more or economic sanctions during a time of war when those actions would be most impactful. The world would be a very uncertain place, with countries needing to decide their new place in it. And no matter who wound up winning the initial war, the one thing we know for sure is that the world would be changed forever. So if you enjoyed this video, why not hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and let us know what kind of video you'd love to see next.